A millionaire on the verge of death saw a homeless woman who looked exactly like his missing daughter, crying under a bridge. When he approached her, the young woman said 3 words that left him speechless. Charles Whitmore held the golden pen between his trembling fingers as he observed the documents spread across the mahogany desk. The letters seemed to dance before his tired eyes, shuffling among the numbers that represented decades of hard work. At 67, the man with perfectly combed grey hair and an impeccable Italian suit carried on his shoulders the weight of an empire built with his own hands. His office on the top floor of the most luxurious commercial building in the city reflected each achievement. Walls covered in marble, expensive paintings, a panoramic view that reached the horizon. But at that moment, as he signed the papers that would divide his inheritance between charities and a few loyal partners, Charles felt a deep emptiness echoing in his chest. He tilted his head to the side, breathing deeply, trying to push away the uncomfortable sensation that had been accompanying him for days. "Who am I leaving all this to, after all?" he thought, feeling a strange tightness rising up his left arm. The secretary entered the room carrying another folder of documents, her high heels echoing on the shiny floor. She was a middle-aged woman, hair tied in a tight bun, always serious and efficient. She placed the papers on the desk carefully, avoiding looking directly into her boss's eyes. Charles noticed her discomfort and felt a pang of sadness upon realizing that even after 20 years working by his side, this woman feared him more than respected him. He had built walls so high around himself that no one could cross them. Not even he himself knew how to tear them down anymore. He picked up the pen again, feeling its weight increase with each second. "Just a few more signatures and everything will be resolved," he said, trying to keep his voice steady as a sharp pain crossed his chest. The secretary nodded in silence and took a step back, keeping her hands crossed in front of her body. Charles tried to concentrate on the dotted lines awaiting his signature, but the pain in his chest intensified rapidly. It was as if someone was squeezing his heart with increasing force, wringing each heartbeat until sucking all the air from his lungs. He dropped the pen on the desk, bringing his left hand to his chest while struggling to breathe. Drops of cold sweat began to run down his forehead, descending along his temples. The room spun around him. The marble walls seemed to tilt. The expensive paintings transformed into blurs of undefined colors. Charles tried to stand up, grasping the edge of the desk, but his legs didn't respond to commands. "Something is wrong," he murmured, feeling panic take over every fiber of his being. The secretary noticed the change in her boss's expression and took a step forward, eyes widened with fright. Charles staggered to the side, knocking over the genuine leather chair that fell with a dull thud against the floor. He now brought both hands to his chest, fingers clenching over the fine fabric of his white shirt as he tried to breathe. Each inhalation seemed impossible, as if an invisible hand was strangling his lungs from within. The pain was unbearable, radiating from the center of his chest to his shoulders, down his arms, up his neck until reaching his jaw. Charles felt his knees give way, and his entire body began to collapse. He extended his right hand toward the secretary, trying to support himself on something but found only air. "Help me," he managed to whisper, before tumbling onto the cold marble floor. The impact of the fall echoed through the office like thunder. The secretary let out a sharp scream that crossed the glass walls, drawing the attention of employees on the lower floors. She ran to Charles, kneeling beside him with hands trembling uncontrollably. The businessman's face was as pale as paper, his lips beginning to turn bluish as he struggled to breathe. His eyes, once so hard and calculating, were now glazed with fear and confusion. The secretary pulled the phone from her pocket, dialing the emergency number with trembling fingers that could barely hit the keys. Charles tried to speak again, but no sound came from his throat. He just watched the white ceiling of the office while feeling life slowly escaping from his body. "This can't be happening to me," he thought, closing his eyes tightly as involuntary tears ran down the sides of his face. Other employees began to enter the office, forming a circle around Charles. Their voices sounded distant and muffled, as if he were submerged in deep water. Someone loosened the knot of his tie. Another brought water, but nothing seemed to make a difference. The pain continued growing, pulsing in increasingly intense waves that threatened to tear away his consciousness. Charles opened his eyes again, seeing the frightened faces of the employees who had worked for him for years. None of them held his hand, none of them cried for him. All just observed with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity, as if they were watching a distant spectacle. He realized with painful clarity that he had spent his entire life building relationships based on fear and self-interest, never on true affection. "I'm dying alone in the midst of dozens of people," he thought, feeling the bitter taste of loneliness burn his throat. The secretary screamed into the phone, providing the building address with a desperate voice, while pressing her other hand against Charles's shoulder. He barely felt her touch, his perception of the world around him beginning to fragment into disconnected pieces. He saw flashes of light, heard distorted sounds, felt his body getting heavier against the cold marble. Memories began to invade his mind without order or meaning. Closing his first important contract at 25, building his first company, the endless nights dedicated to work while everything around him crumbled. And then, like a sharp stab in his already wounded heart, the memory of Victoria's face emerged in his mind. His daughter, his only daughter. Those brown eyes full of hurt and disappointment the last time he saw her, 15 years ago. "Victoria," he murmured with an almost inaudible voice, feeling devastating remorse tear his chest apart from within. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, rapidly approaching the building. The employees stepped back a little, making room while continuing to observe the businessman fallen on the floor. Charles could hear their whispers, speculations about what was happening, some already discussing who would take control of the company. The coldness of those people whom he had enriched over the years cut deeper than any physical pain. He had dedicated his entire existence to accumulating power and money, pushing away everyone who tried to truly get close, including his own daughter. And now, at the moment he needed someone the most, he was surrounded only by self-interested strangers. Charles felt a wave of nausea rise up his throat, followed by an overwhelming dizziness that made the entire environment spin violently. "I wasted my entire life," he thought, letting the tears flow freely as his vision began to darken at the edges. The paramedics burst into the office carrying a stretcher and medical equipment. They were two young men dressed in green uniforms, moving with mechanical efficiency as they knelt beside Charles. One of them quickly checked his vital signs, while the other prepared the oxygen and opened the first aid kit. Charles felt firm hands touching his neck, his wrist opening his shirt to expose his chest. Cold electrodes were attached to his sweaty skin, wires intertwining around his body like spider webs. The heart monitor began to beep with an irregular and frightening rhythm, the digital numbers flashing in red. One paramedic looked at the other with a grave expression, exchanging rapid information that Charles couldn't completely comprehend. He tried to ask what was happening, but his mouth no longer obeyed. "I'm going to die right here," he thought, feeling pure panic run through his veins like liquid fire. "Mr. Whitmore, you're having a heart attack. We need to take you to the hospital now," said the older paramedic, leaning over Charles while speaking slowly and loudly, as if talking to a frightened child. Charles tried to nod, but his neck was too rigid. He just blinked his eyes, feeling hot tears wet his temples. The paramedics worked quickly, placing him on the stretcher with coordinated movements. The entire world swayed when they lifted him, making his stomach churn. Charles closed his eyes tightly, trying to concentrate on breathing. Just breathing, but each inhalation was a lost battle. He felt the cold oxygen entering through his nostrils via the plastic tube, but it seemed to make no difference. His heart continued beating chaotically, skipping beats, accelerating and decelerating without control. "I don't want to die like this," he murmured, knowing that no one really heard him. The stretcher began to move toward the elevator, sliding across the polished floor while employees stepped aside to make way. Charles observed the ceiling passing above him, the fluorescent lights forming white, brilliant lines that hurt his eyes. Each jolt of the stretcher sent waves of pain through his chest, making him groan softly. The secretary ran alongside the paramedics, holding a folder with documents and trying to provide information about medications and medical history. Her voice trembled, but she maintained professional composure despite the evident despair in her eyes. Charles wanted to thank her for all her dedication over the years, wanted to apologize for never being a kind or attentive employer, but the words died in his throat before they could be born. He only watched her with pleading eyes, wishing she could read in his expression everything he couldn't say. "Forgive me for being so hard," he thought, feeling remorse weighing like lead in his already painful chest. The elevator descended with torturous slowness, each floor seeming to last an eternity. Charles felt his heart falter, stumble, struggle to continue pumping blood through his clogged veins. The monitor beside him beeped increasingly irregularly, the numbers fluctuating in a concerning manner. The paramedics exchanged tense glances, communicating through signs that Charles recognized as bad, very bad. He tried to keep his eyes open, fighting against the darkness that threatened to swallow him completely. But he was so tired, so exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in years. His limbs weighed tons, his head throbbed, and the pain in his chest was so intense that he just wanted to close his eyes and let it all end. But what about Victoria? He suddenly thought, feeling a desperate urgency break through the fog of his consciousness. "I need to find her before I die." The elevator doors finally opened on the ground floor, revealing the luxurious lobby of the building now filled with onlookers. The stretcher was pushed quickly through the crowd that stepped aside, unknown faces observing with that same morbid curiosity that Charles so despised. He turned his head to the side, unable to bear those empty stares. The automatic glass doors opened, and a gust of cold night air hit his sweaty face. Charles shuddered, feeling his entire body tremble uncontrollably. The ambulance was parked right in front of the entrance, its red and blue lights spinning and creating hypnotic patterns on the building's facade. The paramedics worked quickly to place the stretcher inside the vehicle, the wheels hitting against the metal platform with dry crashes. Charles was pushed into the ambulance, the tight space smelling of disinfectant and urgency. Everything is happening too fast, he thought, clinging to consciousness like a castaway clutching a piece of wood in the turbulent ocean. The secretary tried to enter the ambulance along with the paramedics, but was gently prevented by one of them. She stood on the sidewalk, holding the folder against her chest while watching the back doors close. Charles saw her through the small window, her pale face illuminated by the flashing lights. She brought her hand to her mouth, her shoulders beginning to shake, and Charles realized that perhaps, just perhaps, this woman really cared about him in some way. But then the doors closed completely, and she disappeared from view. The ambulance began to move, the siren tearing through the silence of the night as the vehicle accelerated through the city streets. Charles felt every curve, every sudden break, every jolt in the road. The paramedic beside him constantly adjusted the equipment, checking the monitor, noting information on a clipboard. "Stay with us, Mr. Whitmore." "We're almost at the hospital," said the young man, his voice trying to sound reassuring but carrying an unmistakable tension. Charles tried to respond, but all that came out was a weak, hoarse moan. The pain in his chest had transformed into something different now, a crushing pressure that seemed to want to split his body in half. He gasped for air, but his lungs refused to expand completely. Sweat ran all over his body, soaking his torn shirt, sticking his hair to his forehead. He felt cold and hot at the same time, violent tremors shaking his limbs, while his heart continued its erratic and deadly dance. The monitor beside him began to beep more urgently, a sharp and persistent sound that pierced his ears. The paramedic leaned over him, checking the electrodes, adjusting something on the equipment. Charles saw real concern in the young man's eyes, and that frightened him more than any physical pain. "This is the end, isn't it?" he thought, feeling tears burning his tired eyes. Suddenly, without warning, Charles's world exploded in pure and unbearable pain. His chest seemed to implode as if a bomb had detonated inside him. The monitor began to emit a continuous and terrifying sound, a long and invariable note that echoed through the ambulance. The paramedic shouted something to the driver, then quickly turned to Charles, positioning his hands on his chest. Charles could barely process what was happening, his mind fragmenting into millions of pieces, while pain consumed him completely. He felt the hands pressing firmly on his chest, once, twice, 3 times, in a steady and desperate rhythm. But the pain was going away now, replaced by a strange sensation of detachment. "I'm dying," he thought with sudden and terrifying clarity, feeling his body begin to float in an infinite void. The paramedic continued compressing his chest, counting aloud while working. Another paramedic whom Charles hadn't noticed before appeared at his side, preparing additional equipment. There was urgency in every movement, a well-rehearsed dance against death unfolding in the tight space of the moving ambulance. Charles observed everything from some distant and disconnected place, as if he were watching a movie about someone else. He no longer felt his body, felt no pain, felt nothing but a deep and all-encompassing tiredness. The voices of the paramedics sounded muffled and distorted, reaching him through layers upon layers of invisible cotton. He saw one of the men grab something like 2 metal plates, positioning them on his bare chest. "Clear!" he heard someone shout, followed by a countdown that seemed to come from very, very far away. "Victoria, my girl, I'm sorry for everything," he thought, letting himself sink into the darkness that called him with promises of eternal rest. The ambulance finally began to decelerate, the curves becoming gentler as they entered what Charles assumed to be the hospital complex. He could hear other sirens in the distance, the constant noise of a busy emergency department. The vehicle stopped abruptly, and immediately the rear doors were opened, revealing a complete medical team waiting outside. Bright hospital lights flooded the interior of the ambulance, temporarily blinding Charles. Voices overlapped one another, medical reports being transmitted quickly as the stretcher was pulled out. The cold night air touched his face again before being replaced by the suffocating heat of the building. They moved quickly, the stretcher sliding across the smooth floor as they proceeded through white and sterile corridors. The ceiling passed above Charles in a blur of fluorescent lights and directional signs. "How much time do I have left?" he thought, feeling his heart stumble again, failing once more to maintain the rhythm necessary to keep him alive. They entered an emergency room, and suddenly Charles was surrounded by people dressed in white and green. Hands touched his body from all sides, more electrodes being applied, needles piercing his veins, masks being placed over his face. The voices blended into an incomprehensible whirlwind of medical terms and urgent commands. He tried to focus on one face, any face, something to anchor his consciousness that threatened to slip away again. A doctor appeared in his field of vision, a middle-aged woman with dark hair tied in a ponytail and tired but determined eyes. She leaned over him, checking his eyes with a small flashlight. The light was painfully bright, making Charles blink and look away. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Dr. Foster. You're in the emergency room. We're going to take care of you, but I need you to try to stay awake, all right?" she said, her voice firm but not devoid of compassion. Charles tried to nod, but he wasn't sure if he had managed to move his head. Everything was becoming confusing again, the edges of his vision darkening like ink spreading on wet paper. He fought against it, trying to cling to the doctor's words, to the sound of her voice, to anything that could keep him tethered to the real world. But it was so difficult. It required so much effort, and he was so tired. His eyes began to close against his will, his eyelids weighing tons. Someone shouted his name, shook his shoulder forcefully, but it seemed to be happening in another universe, separated from him by layers upon layers of thick fog. The monitor began to beep that terrible sound again, the long and continuous note that meant his heart had stopped once more. He felt the table vibrate beneath his body when the medical team began the chest compressions, firm hands pressing his chest in a constant rhythm. "Victoria, my daughter, I'm so sorry," he thought, letting himself slide into the welcoming darkness that promised an end to all pain. Charles opened his eyes slowly, feeling as if he were emerging from a deep, dark well. Everything around him seemed distant and blurry, as if he were observing the world through frosted glass. He blinked several times, trying to focus his vision, and gradually realized that he was no longer in the emergency room. The environment was different now, quieter, with soft lighting coming from monitors blinking beside him. There were white curtains partially closed around his bed, creating a sense of illusory privacy. He tried to move his head and felt a dull pain radiating from the base of his skull. His entire body seemed made of lead, heavy and inert. Tubes came out of his arms, wires connected his chest to machines that beeped softly in a constant rhythm. "Where am I?" he thought, feeling a primitive fear tightening his stomach as he tried to remember how he had gotten there. A nurse appeared beside his bed, checking something on one of the monitors. She was a young woman, with brown hair tied in a bun and tired eyes that suggested a long shift. When she noticed Charles was awake, she turned to him with a gentle but professional smile. She came closer, and carefully adjusted the pillow under his head, her movements smooth and precise. Charles tried to speak, but his throat was dry as sandpaper, and only a hoarse sound emerged. The nurse took a cup with water and a straw, bringing it to his lips. The cold water went down his throat, relieving some of the discomfort, although swallowing was still painful. "You're in the intensive care unit, Mr. Whitmore. You had a very serious heart attack, but we managed to stabilize you," she said, her voice calm and comforting as she placed the cup back on the small table beside him. Charles nodded weakly, processing the information while feeling tears of relief burn his eyes. "How long have I been—" Charles began to ask, but his voice failed in the middle of the sentence. He coughed, feeling a sharp pain cross his chest. The nurse waited patiently while he caught his breath, her expression showing genuine concern. She checked the monitor again before answering, noting something on a clipboard she held. Charles observed her every movement, trying to find clues about his real condition in the expressions on her face. But she maintained a well-trained professional mask, not revealing much beyond careful cordiality. Finally, she turned to him again and answered in a soft voice. "You arrived here last night. It's almost 8 in the morning now. You've been asleep most of the time, which is good. Your body needs rest to recover," she said, adjusting the sheet around him as she spoke. Charles felt a shock, realizing he had lost so many hours, as if pieces of his life were being torn away without his permission. "I almost died, didn't I?" He asked Charles, his voice coming out stronger now, though still hoarse and trembling. He needed to hear the truth, not softened versions or half words meant to protect him from reality. The nurse hesitated for a moment, slightly biting her lower lip as she considered how to respond. She pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, a gesture that Charles appreciated because it placed him at the same level instead of keeping him as an inferior patient. She crossed her hands on her lap and looked directly into his eyes, her expression becoming more serious. Charles could see the fatigue on her face, the lines around her eyes, and wondered how many difficult conversations she had already had throughout her career. "You've had 3 cardiac arrests since you arrived. They were very critical moments, but the medical team managed to resuscitate you each time," she said, her voice carrying the weight of honesty as she held his gaze. Charles closed his eyes, feeling the full impact of those words pierce his chest like a blade. Heavy silence settled between them for a few moments. Charles kept his eyes closed, trying to process the fact that he had been on the brink of death multiple times in a matter of hours. 3 times his heart had stopped beating. 3 times he had crossed that invisible line between life and absolute nothingness. And 3 times someone had decided it wasn't his time yet, pulling him back against his will. He thought of Victoria again, as he always did in moments of greatest vulnerability. His daughter was somewhere in the world, living a life he didn't know, carrying hurts he had caused. And he had almost died without the chance to ask forgiveness, without the chance to say that he had always loved her, even when he was too cruel to show it. "I need to live," he murmured, opening his eyes again and staring at the nurse with desperate intensity. "I have something I need to do, someone I need to find." The nurse tilted her head slightly, her expression softening with something that seemed like understanding. She had probably heard variations of this same declaration from dozens of patients over the years, each one carrying their own regrets and unfinished business, but she showed no cynicism or disbelief, only nodded gently. She rose from the chair and adjusted one of the intravenous tubes connected to Charles's arm, checking the flow of medication. Her hands were skilled and careful, touching him with a gentleness he hadn't received in a long time. Charles felt a deep gratitude for this unknown woman, who cared for him with such dedication, even though he was just another patient among many others. "The doctor will come to examine you soon, Mr. Whitmore. He can better explain your condition and what lies ahead," she said, giving a light pat on his shoulder before starting to move away. Charles felt a sudden fear of being alone again, but didn't have the courage to ask her to stay. Charles lay in silence, watching the white curtains that separated him from the other ICU patients. He could hear muffled sounds around him, the beeping of monitors, whispered conversations between medical staff members, occasional coughs from other patients. Each sound seemed amplified in the tense quietness of that place, where life and death danced in precarious balance. He looked at his own hands resting on the white sheet and was shocked at how fragile and old they appeared. When had it happened? When had he become this man with wrinkled, spotted skin, protruding veins and trembling fingers? He had always seen himself as strong, invincible, capable of controlling everything and everyone around him. But now, trapped in that hospital bed, connected to machines that kept his body functioning, he was nothing but an old and frightened man facing his own mortality. 67 years, he thought, feeling the crushing weight of each year lost in empty ambition and self-imposed loneliness. The curtain was pulled aside abruptly, making Charles give a small, startled jump. A doctor entered, followed by two residents who carried clipboards and observed everything with studious attention. The doctor was a tall man, probably in his 50s, with perfectly combed grey hair and thin-framed glasses. He wore an immaculate white coat with his name embroidered on the pocket. Although Charles couldn't read the letters without his own glasses, the doctor approached the bed with confident steps, quickly checking the monitors before turning his attention to Charles. There was a natural authority in his posture, the kind of confidence that comes from decades of saving lives. He pulled a stethoscope from around his neck and leaned over Charles, pressing the cold instrument against his chest while listening attentively. Charles held his breath involuntarily, as if making noise could interfere with the examination. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Dr. Hayes, the cardiologist in charge of your case. How are you feeling this morning?" he asked, putting away the stethoscope while studying Charles's face with experienced and analytical eyes. "I'm alive, I guess that's something," Charles replied, trying to smile but managing only a weak grimace. His voice still came out hoarse, each word requiring conscious effort. Dr. Hayes nodded, but didn't return the smile. His expression remained serious and professional, which immediately put Charles on alert. He had dealt with powerful people and difficult situations throughout his business life and had learned to read body language and facial expressions with precision. What he saw in the doctor's face was not encouraging. The residents remained silent behind the doctor, noting observations on their clipboards while observing every detail of the interaction. Charles felt exposed under all those clinical gazes, reduced to an interesting medical case instead of a human being. "Doctor, be straightforward with me. I need to know the truth about my condition," said Charles, his voice gaining a bit of the authoritative firmness he used to use in important negotiations. He needed answers, not false hopes or kind words meant to sweeten a bitter reality. Dr. Hayes pulled the chair the nurse had left beside the bed and sat down, a gesture that Charles immediately recognized as the prelude to bad news. Doctors only sat down when they had difficult things to say. The doctor folded his hands in his lap and took a deep breath before beginning to speak, choosing his words with the care of someone who knows the impact they will have. The residents stopped writing and paid attention, probably eager to learn how to communicate serious prognoses to patients. Charles felt his heart speed up slightly, the monitor next to him beeping a bit faster in response to his growing anxiety. He gripped the sheet with his hands, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. "Mr. Whitmore, you've suffered what we call an extensive acute myocardial infarction. In simpler terms, a large portion of your heart muscle was damaged due to lack of oxygen," the doctor began, pausing to ensure Charles was following along. Charles nodded, indicating he understood, although he felt a chill run down his spine upon hearing those words. "Your heart is very weak now, Mr. Whitmore. It's not able to pump blood adequately to the rest of your body, Doctor," Hayes continued, his voice remaining calm and objective despite the gravity of what he was saying. He occasionally gestured with his hands, as if drawing invisible diagrams in the air to help Charles visualize what he was explaining. Charles observed every movement, every expression, trying to extract information beyond the words. The doctor continued talking about blocked arteries, irreversible damage to heart tissue, risks of new cardiac arrests. Each sentence was like a hammer striking against the wall of denial that Charles was trying to build around himself. He didn't want to believe that his body had failed so catastrophically, that the machine that had kept him functioning for 67 years was now irreparably broken. "Is there any treatment? Some surgery?" "I have money, I can pay whatever is necessary," said Charles, feeling desperation tinge his words as he clung to the one thing that had always given him power, his wealth. "Doctor." Hayes exchanged a brief look with the residents before returning his attention to Charles. There was something in that look, a silent communication that Charles couldn't fully decipher, but which filled him with apprehension. The doctor adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, his hands still crossed, but now resting on his knees. Charles could see small wrinkles around the doctor's eyes, marks of years dealing with difficult situations and impossible decisions. There was also a deep fatigue there, the weariness of someone who carries the weight of human lives on his shoulders daily. There is a surgery that could help, yes. We would need to perform what we call myocardial revascularization. Basically, we would create new pathways for blood to circulate around the blocked arteries, the doctor explained, but his tone was not encouraging. Charles felt a spark of hope light up in his chest, but it was quickly smothered by the doctor's next sentence. "But there's a serious problem, Mr. Whitmore. Your heart is too weak to withstand such a major surgery at this moment," said Dr. Hayes, and Charles felt those words fall on him like heavy stones. The doctor continued explaining about surgical risks, survival chances, possibilities of complications. The numbers and percentages floated around Charles without really registering in his stunned mind. All he could understand was that he was trapped in an impossible cycle. He needed the surgery to survive, but he was too weak to survive the surgery. It was like being in a cruel trap with no visible way out. He closed his eyes, feeling hot tears pressing against his eyelids. Throughout his life, he had solved problems with money, power, and determination. But this was something no amount of money could buy, no influence could modify. "So I'm going to die?" he asked, his voice coming out as a broken whisper as he opened his eyes again to face the doctor. Dr. Hayes didn't respond immediately. He studied Charles's face for a long moment, as if carefully weighing his next words. The residents remained motionless behind him, silent witnesses to this conversation, laden with existential weight. Charles could hear his own heart beating irregularly through the monitor, each beat reminding him of how fragile was the thread that kept him connected to life. He thought again of Victoria, of how he had wasted 15 years he could have spent rebuilding the relationship with his daughter. 15 years of stupid pride and stubbornness that now seemed so insignificant before the eternity that awaited him. "I won't lie to you. Your condition is extremely serious. But there is a chance, small but real, that we might be able to perform the surgery if we can stabilize you a bit more." Charles clung to that word like a castaway clinging to a floating piece of wood. Chance. There was a chance, no matter how small. Throughout his life, he had bet on remote chances and transformed imminent failures into spectacular successes. Perhaps he could do it one more time. Perhaps there was still time to fix at least some of the mistakes he had made. He opened his mouth to answer, but was interrupted by the sound of voices from the other side of the curtain. Hurried footsteps approached, followed by a tense conversation between the nurse and someone Charles couldn't identify. The curtain was pulled aside again, revealing 3 men in suits standing outside. Charles recognized them immediately. They were his lawyers and 2 of his main business partners. They carried leather portfolios and tablets, their expressions showing a mixture of formal concern and poorly disguised anxiety. "Mr. Whitmore, we apologize for the intrusion, but there are urgent matters that need your attention," said the older lawyer, a corpulent man with a grey mustache and deep voice. Charles felt nausea rise in his throat as he realized that even here at death's door, he was still seen primarily as a business asset. Dr. Hayes rose abruptly, his expression becoming visibly irritated. He turned to the men in suits with a defensive posture, positioning himself between them and Charles like a protective guardian. The residents also seemed uncomfortable with the intrusion, exchanging confused looks. Charles watched the scene unfold with a strange detachment, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. He saw the men who worked for him, who had grown rich from the companies he had built, and could feel nothing but a profound emptiness. None of them had asked how he was. None of them had shown any genuine concern for his well-being. All they wanted were his signatures on documents, his business decisions, his value as a source of profit. "My patient has just suffered a severe heart attack and had 3 cardiac arrests. He is in no condition to discuss business," said Dr. Hayes, his voice sharp and authoritative as he stared at the intruders with clear disapproval. The lawyers and partners exchanged uncomfortable glances, but did not back down. The older lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture before speaking again. He held a tablet in his left hand and a folder in his right, as if those objects were armor protecting him from the raw reality of the situation. Charles could see drops of sweat forming on the man's forehead, betraying his anxiety despite his professional posture. The other two men remained slightly behind, observing the interaction attentively, probably mentally calculating the financial implications of each passing second. "We completely understand, Doctor. But there are contracts with deadlines expiring today, decisions that only Mr. Whitmore can make. If they aren't resolved immediately, the losses will be catastrophic," explained the lawyer, directing his gaze alternately between the doctor and Charles. His voice carried an urgency that Charles recognized well. It was the sound of money slipping through fingers. "Millions are at stake, Doctor," the man added, as if that would resolve everything. Charles observed the men with sudden and painful clarity. For decades, he had surrounded himself with people exactly like them, efficient, focused on results, devoid of sentimentality. He had purposefully built a structure around himself where emotions were seen as weaknesses and genuine human relationships were replaced by mutually beneficial transactions. And it had worked perfectly for accumulating wealth and power. But now, lying in that hospital bed, facing the real possibility of never getting up again, he saw with brutal honesty how pathetic it all was. Millions of dollars, contracts, deadlines. None of it mattered when compared to the fact that he could die at any moment, and there would be no one by his side crying for him, no one holding his hand, no one genuinely lamenting his departure. "Let them in," said Charles, his voice coming out weak but audible. Dr. Hayes turned to him with an expression of disapproval and concern, but Charles made a tired gesture with his hand. "Mr. Whitmore, I really don't advise this. You need to rest, not stress yourself with business," protested Dr. Hayes, approaching the bed again while casting furious glances at the men in suits. There was a protective rigidity in his posture, as if he considered it his medical duty to defend Charles against those people who clearly didn't have his best interests in mind. The residents remained close to the wall, watching everything with uncertain expressions, probably wondering if they should intervene somehow. Charles appreciated the doctor's concern, even felt touched by it, but he knew there was no point in delaying the inevitable. These people would keep coming back, insisting, pressuring, until they got what they wanted. "It's all right, Doctor. Let them do what they came to do. The sooner we finish this, the sooner they'll leave," Charles replied, briefly closing his eyes as he felt a deep fatigue wash over him. Each word required immense effort, as if he were pushing stones uphill. Dr. Hayes hesitated for another moment, before yielding with a resigned sigh. He stepped away from the bed, abruptly gesturing for the men in suits to enter, but made it clear through his body language that he didn't approve of any of this. The residents followed him, positioning themselves near the wall but remaining in the room, silent witnesses to what was about to happen. The three men in suits advanced quickly, surrounding Charles's bed like birds of prey around wounded game. They opened their folders and tablets simultaneously, preparing documents and contracts with the mechanical efficiency of people who did this routinely. The older lawyer began talking rapidly about deadlines, contractual clauses, penalties for delays, but Charles was barely listening. He observed the faces of those men, looking for some sign of human empathy, some indication that they cared about him as a person and not just as a source of authorization for financial transactions. "Where is my secretary?" Charles suddenly asked, interrupting the lawyer's verbal flow. The three men stopped and looked at each other, confused by the unexpected question. The older lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses while checking something on his tablet. One of the partners, a younger man with perfectly combed black hair, stepped forward to respond. He wore an expensive grey suit that probably cost more than many people's monthly salary, and his Italian leather shoes gleamed under the ICU lights. Charles recognized the type. Ambitious, calculating, willing to do anything to climb the corporate ladder. He himself had been like that once, decades ago, before success transformed him into something even worse. "She's handling matters at the office, Mr. Whitmore, keeping operations running during your absence," the partner responded, his voice professional and neutral. There was a poorly disguised impatience in his tone, a clear desire to return to the matters that really mattered, the documents that needed to be signed. "Now, if we could return to these contracts," he began, but Charles interrupted him again. "She didn't come to visit me? Nobody came? No employee, no acquaintance?" Charles pressed, feeling a devastating sadness tighten his chest. His voice carried a vulnerability he rarely allowed to show through, especially in front of subordinates. The three men became visibly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, exchanging nervous glances, as if expecting one of them to know how to handle this unexpected emotional situation. They had come prepared to discuss numbers, strategies, contracts, not to face the fragile human side of their boss. Charles saw the answer before any of them spoke. No, nobody had come. Nobody had cared enough to lose a few hours of work to visit the dying man who had enriched them. "I understand," Charles said calmly, although he felt as if something had broken inside him. "Pass me the documents. Let's get this over with." The lawyer quickly approached, relieved to return to familiar territory. He placed a series of papers on a clipboard and positioned it on Charles's lap, quickly explaining what each document represented. His voice had resumed that professional and distant tone, reciting clauses and legal terms with the ease of someone who had memorized them long ago. Charles watched the words dance on the page before his eyes without really processing them. He had built such a vast empire that now he needed to sign papers even on his deathbed to keep it functioning. And for what? For whom? When he died, and judging by what Dr. Hayes had said this could be soon, all of it would be distributed among strangers and institutions. There was no son to inherit his legacy, no family to carry his name forward. Victoria. His mind always returned to Victoria. "Do you have a pen?" Charles asked, extending his trembling hand while trying to focus on the blurred documents. The youngest partner quickly offered an expensive pen, probably a corporate gift or something purchased with the money Charles paid him. He placed it in Charles's hand carefully, as if he were delivering a sacred object. Charles closed his fingers around the pen, feeling the cold weight of the metal against his skin. His hands were visibly shaking, both from physical weakness and the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him completely. He tried to guide the pen to the first dotted line, but found that his fingers did not properly obey his brain's commands. The pen tip slid across the paper irregularly, leaving trembling and almost illegible marks. The men around observed in silence, probably calculating how long this would take. Charles felt tears burning his eyes, but suppressed them with effort. He wasn't going to cry in front of these people. "Victoria," he murmured suddenly without realizing he had spoken aloud. His daughter's name escaped his lips like a prayer, like a lament. The three men in suits looked at each other, confused. The older lawyer leaned in slightly, furrowing his brow as he tried to understand what Charles had said. One of the partners quickly checked something on his tablet, probably searching his records to see if there was any Victoria relevant to Charles's business. Dr. Hayes, who had remained near the wall observing everything with silent disapproval, stepped forward with a concerned expression. Charles continued holding the pen above the paper, but was no longer signing anything. His hands had stopped moving, frozen in the air while his mind wandered far from that cold, sterile room. He saw Victoria's face as it was 15 years ago, young and frightened, begging for his understanding. He saw the expression of deep hurt when he rejected her, when he said terrible things he could never undo. "For Victoria," he repeated louder this time, his voice breaking as tears finally began to roll down his face without him being able to control them. "Mr. Whitmore? Who is Victoria?" asked the lawyer, his voice showing more professional curiosity than genuine concern. Charles didn't answer, lost in memories that haunted him relentlessly. The pen fell from his hand, rolling across the sheet and leaving a blue ink mark on the white fabric. The documents began to slide from his lap, some falling to the floor with soft whispers of paper. No one moved to pick them up. Charles brought his hands to his face, covering his eyes as he sobbed silently. For years he had repressed those emotions, buried them under layers of work and ambition. But now, facing his own mortality, all defenses had crumbled. He cried for the daughter he had lost, for the granddaughter who probably didn't even know of his existence, for the years wasted in pride and stubbornness. "My daughter. Victoria is my daughter," he managed to say between sobs, his voice muffled by the hands covering his face. The monitor beside him began to beep more rapidly, recording his growing emotional agitation. Dr. Hayes approached quickly, placing his hand on Charles's shoulder while checking the monitors with an alarmed expression. He turned to the men in suits with barely contained anger, making abrupt gestures toward the door. His patience had clearly run out, and he was no longer willing to allow them to continue disturbing his patient. The residents also approached, positioning themselves to create a physical barrier between Charles and the unwanted visitors. The nurse who had been there before came running back, probably alerted by the changes in Charles's vital signs. She began adjusting medications and checking equipment with quick, efficient movements. "Leave. Now." "You've already caused enough damage," ordered Dr. Hayes, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. There was no more diplomacy in his tone, only absolute medical authority and moral indignation. "My patient is in critical condition, and you are worsening his condition. If you don't leave immediately, I will call security." The men in suits hesitated, clearly torn between their mission to obtain the necessary signatures and the embarrassment of being expelled in such a humiliating manner. The older lawyer tried to protest, opening his mouth to say something about the importance of the contracts, but Dr. Hayes's withering glare silenced him. The partners hurriedly began collecting the scattered documents, storing them in their folders with awkward movements. One of them muttered something about coming back later when Mr. Whitmore was more stable. But Dr. Hayes firmly pointed to the door, allowing no more delays. The three men finally yielded, moving away from the bed while exchanging frustrated glances. They passed through the curtain and disappeared, the sound of their hurried steps echoing down the ICU hallway. "I apologize for that, Mr. Whitmore." "I shouldn't have allowed them in," said the doctor, his voice softening as he turned back to his patient. Charles continued crying silently, unable to stop the tears that flowed uncontrollably. The nurse applied something to one of the intravenous tubes, probably a mild sedative to calm Charles. She worked in silence, her movements gentle and careful, treating him with a dignity that the previous visitors had not demonstrated. Charles felt a wave of gratitude for these people, who cared for him not for money or obligation, but because they had chosen a profession dedicated to alleviating human suffering. The medication began to take effect quickly, bringing an artificial calmness that attenuated the emotional peak but did not eliminate the deep pain he carried. His hands stopped trembling so much, his breathing began to regulate and the tears gradually ceased. But the emptiness in his chest remained, an open wound that no medicine could heal. "Sorry," mumbled Charles, wiping his face with the back of his hand, in an almost childlike gesture. "I didn't mean to lose control like that." "There's nothing to apologize for, Mr. Whitmore. You've been through a traumatic experience and are dealing with intense emotions. That's perfectly normal," replied Dr. Hayes, pulling the chair over again and sitting beside the bed. He folded his hands in his lap and waited patiently until Charles was calm enough to continue the conversation. The residents had discreetly moved away, giving them some privacy. The nurse finished her adjustments and also withdrew, partially closing the curtain behind her. Charles took several deep breaths, trying to gather strength to speak about something he had kept silent for so many years. It was strange how being on the brink of death dissolved the barriers he had so carefully built around his deepest feelings. "I have a daughter, Victoria. Or had. I don't know if she's still alive. It's been 15 years since I've seen her, since I threw her out of the house," began Charles, his voice gaining strength as the words started to flow. It was like opening a floodgate that had been closed for far too long. Dr. Hayes listened in silence without interrupting, allowing Charles to speak at his own pace. There was genuine compassion in his eyes now, the kind of human empathy that transcends the doctor-patient relationship and touches something more fundamental. Charles continued telling his story, words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. He spoke about Victoria growing up without a mother, about how he had been a distant and cold father, always prioritizing business over family. He spoke about her pregnancy, about how he had reacted with anger and disappointment instead of support and understanding. He spoke about the cruel words he had said, about how he had called her a failure and a disgrace, about how he had thrown her out of the house when she needed him most. And he spoke about the 15 years of silence that followed, years in which his pride had prevented him from seeking her out, from asking forgiveness, from trying to fix what he had broken. "I loved her, Doctor. I always loved her. But I never knew how to show it. And now it may be too late, concluded Charles, feeling his throat tighten again. It's never too late as long as we're still alive, Mr. Whitmore, said Dr. Hayes softly, placing his hand over Charles's in a comforting gesture. His words carried a wisdom that came not just from years of medicine, but from a deep understanding of the human condition. Charles clung to those words like a castaway clinging to a lifeline. Perhaps there was still time. Perhaps if he survived the surgery, he could use the rest of his days, however few they might be, to find Victoria and ask for her forgiveness. To meet his granddaughter if she existed. To finally be the father he should have been from the beginning. Then I need to have this surgery, doctor, no matter how risky it is. I need to live long enough to try to fix what I destroyed, declared Charles, his voice gaining a determination that surprised them both. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he had a real purpose, something beyond accumulating wealth and power. Dr. Hayes studied Charles for a long moment, his eyes scanning the patient's face as if trying to measure his conviction. There were enormous risks involved, significant chances that Charles would not survive the surgical procedure. But the doctor also recognized that without the surgery, death was practically certain, just a matter of time. And perhaps there was something in Charles's burning desire to make peace with his past that could give him the strength needed to survive what was coming. The doctor sighed deeply, as if he were making a decision that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He picked up the clipboard that one of the residents had left on the nearby table and began to leaf through some papers. Very well, Mr. Whitmore. I'll prepare everything for surgery, but I need you to understand the risks. There's a very real chance that you won't survive the procedure. Your heart is in very precarious condition, explained the doctor, his voice once again taking on that professional tone, but not devoid of humanity. I understand, doctor, and I accept the risks, Charles replied without hesitation. There was a clarity in his mind now that didn't exist before, an acceptance that some things were worth risking everything for. If he died on the operating table, at least he would have died trying to live long enough to fix his mistakes. And if he survived, he would have a second chance he didn't deserve but for which he was deeply grateful. Dr. Hayes nodded, understanding that the decision had been made. He stood up and called the nurse back, giving quick instructions about pre-operative preparations. The movement around increased again, people coming and going, checking equipment, preparing documents. Charles observed everything with a strange calmness, as if he were saying goodbye to the world in slow motion. We'll need you to sign a consent form for the surgery, said the nurse, approaching with a clipboard and a form. Her hands were gentle when she positioned the document where Charles could reach it. Charles took the pen she offered, his hands trembling less now thanks to the medications running through his veins. He looked at the document, but the words were just blurs without real meaning. All that mattered was the decision he had already made. He guided the pen to the dotted line at the bottom of the page, pressing the tip against the paper. His signature came out irregular and shaky, almost unrecognizable compared to the firm, authoritative signature he used to use on business contracts. But it was there, his agreement to risk everything for a chance at redemption. He returned the pen to the nurse and leaned back on the pillow, feeling a deep fatigue wash over him again. Each movement, each word, each emotion cost an energy he barely had. It's done, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Thoughts about Victoria flooded his mind again, that young and hurt face he would never be able to forget. The medical team worked quickly around him, preparing him to be transferred to the operating room. Someone adjusted his bed. Another checked all the tubes and wires connected to him, ensuring nothing would disconnect during transport. Charles felt strangely disconnected from everything, as if he were floating slightly above his own body, observing the preparations from a safe distance. The sedative medication was definitely taking effect now, dampening his acute emotions and creating a protective layer between him and the terrifying reality of what he was about to face. He thought of all the choices that had brought him to this moment, every decision to prioritize work over family, every harsh word spoken in anger, every opportunity for love rejected in favor of cold ambition. If I could go back in time, he thought, feeling tears burn his eyes again, I would do everything so differently. Dr. Hayes reappeared beside his bed, now wearing green surgical clothes. There was a seriousness in his face that wasn't there before, the expression of a man about to enter battle against death with medical tools as his only weapons. He placed his hand briefly on Charles's shoulder, a gesture of silent encouragement. Charles tried to smile, tried to show bravery, but all he managed was a trembling and uncertain expression. He was afraid, more frightened than he had ever been in his entire life. He wasn't afraid of death itself, but of dying with so many unfinished matters, so many words unsaid, so much love unexpressed. "Doctor," Charles called, his voice coming out weak but urgent. The doctor leaned in to hear him better, bringing his face closer to Charles's. "If I don't survive, is there any way to find my daughter, to leave a message for her?" Dr. Hayes hesitated, clearly not expecting that question. He exchanged a quick look with the nurse, who was busy checking Charles's vital signs on the monitor. The doctor's expression softened, showing understanding and compassion for the desperate urgency that Charles felt. He nodded slowly, as if making a personal commitment that went beyond his professional responsibilities. "We'll do our best to locate her, Mr. Whitmore, but focus on surviving. You yourself will be able to tell her everything you need to say," replied the doctor, giving Charles's shoulder a firm squeeze before stepping away to allow the team to finish their preparations. Charles closed his eyes, trying to believe those words, trying to hold on to the hope that there would still be time. But the fear remained, a cold and persistent companion that whispered terrible possibilities into his tired mind. The bed began to move, being pushed out of the ICU toward the elevators that would take Charles to the operating room. He kept his eyes closed, listening to the rhythmic sound of wheels on the smooth floor, the muffled conversations of the medical team, the distant beeping of other patients' monitors. The world around him was a cacophony of hospital sounds that mixed into a strange and uncomfortable symphony. He felt the movement change when they entered the elevator, the sensation of descent making his stomach turn slightly. Memories continued flowing through his mind in an uncontrolled torrent. Victoria as a baby in his arms, so small and fragile that he was afraid of breaking her. Victoria as a child making drawings for him that he never had time to properly appreciate. Victoria as a teenager trying to talk about her dreams while he read financial newspapers. Victoria as a young adult begging for understanding that he had refused to give. "Forgive me, my daughter," he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear him but needing to say it anyway. The elevator doors opened and the bed was pushed through more corridors, these colder and more antiseptic than the previous ones. Charles briefly opened his eyes and saw fluorescent lights passing above him in hypnotic sequence, one after another, marking his journey toward an uncertain destination. People dressed in surgical green hurried by in both directions, each absorbed in their own urgent tasks. He was just another patient being taken for another surgery in that busy hospital, but for him, this was the most important moment of his life. Perhaps the last moment. The bed finally stopped in front of double doors with signs indicating operating room, restricted access. Someone pressed a button on the wall, and the doors opened automatically, revealing an even more sterile and cold corridor on the other side. "It's time, Mr. Whitmore. We're going to take good care of you," said the nurse who had accompanied him throughout the journey, her voice carrying a maternal gentleness that made Charles want to cry again. The bed was pushed through the double doors, entering a world of gleaming white tiles and cold air. Charles began to shiver, both from the cold and from the fear that finally refused to be contained. His teeth began to chatter involuntarily as the bed was positioned near the doors of an operating room. He could see through small round windows in the door, a surgical table surrounded by intimidating equipment, giant surgical lights hanging from the ceiling like mechanical eyes, waiting to witness every cut into his body. Members of the surgical team moved inside the room, preparing instruments, checking equipment, creating a sterile environment where life and death would dance their delicate ballet. Charles felt his heart dangerously accelerate, the monitor beside him beeping faster and faster. A sensation of absolute panic began to rise in his throat, threatening to completely suffocate him. "I can't do this. I'm not ready," he thought desperately, feeling the irrational impulse to jump off the bed and flee from that place. But then Dr. Hayes appeared again in his field of vision, now completely suited up for surgery, with a mask covering his face, leaving only his eyes visible. but it was enough. Charles could see determination in those eyes, a silent promise to fight for his life with every tool and skill available. The doctor placed both hands on Charles's shoulders, pressing lightly, anchoring him to the present moment. "I know you're afraid, Mr. Whitmore. That's normal and natural, but you made the right decision. We're going to do everything in our power to bring you back and give you the chance you need," said the doctor, his voice muffled by the mask but still clear and firm. Charles nodded weakly, trying to absorb that confidence, trying to believe there was hope. The team began to move him again, preparing to transfer him to the operating room itself. It was really time. There was no turning back. Someone began applying something to his intravenous tube, probably anesthetic, to make him sleep during the procedure. Charles felt a heavy drowsiness begin to take over his consciousness, his eyelids becoming impossible to keep open. The voices around him began to sound distant and distorted, as if he were being pulled down into deep water. He fought against it for a few seconds, trying to cling to reality for one more moment, just one more moment. There was something he needed to say, something important. Hours later, Charles slowly opened his eyes, feeling as if he were emerging from a dark and endless tunnel. Everything around him seemed covered by a thick fog, muffled and distant sounds reaching his ears, like echoes coming from far away. He blinked several times, trying to focus his vision, and gradually realized that he was lying in a different bed, in a room he didn't recognize. The walls were a neutral white. There was a window with partially closed curtains allowing daylight to enter in soft beams. He was no longer in the ICU, of that he was certain. The environment was quieter, more private, although it still carried that characteristic hospital smell that seemed to permeate everything. He tried to move his head and felt a dull pain cross his neck and shoulders. His entire body ached, every muscle protesting against the slightest movement. Tubes still came out of his arms, monitors still beeped softly beside him, but there were fewer pieces of equipment than before. "I survived," he thought, feeling a confused mixture of relief and surprise wash over him like an unexpected wave. He tried to move more, tried to sit up in bed, but found he was too weak to do more than slightly raise his head. His chest was bandaged under the hospital gown, and he could feel a persistent discomfort in the area where the surgeons had worked. It wasn't exactly pain, more like a constant and uncomfortable pressure that reminded him with each breath of what his body had endured. He looked around the empty room, searching for someone, anyone who could explain where he was and what had happened. But there was no one, just him, alone in that sterile and impersonal space. No flowers, no get-well cards, no sign that anyone had cared enough to send even a symbolic gesture. The loneliness of that empty room echoed the loneliness of his entire life, a cruel mirror reflecting decades of self-imposed isolation. "It's so quiet," he muttered, his voice coming out hoarse and rough, feeling the crushing weight of being completely alone in one of the most vulnerable moments of his existence. The door to the room opened softly and a nurse entered, carrying a clipboard and checking something in her records. She was different from the nurse who had attended to him before, an older woman with grey hair tied in a loose bun and a face that carried marks of years of dedicated work. When she realized Charles was awake, her face lit up with a gentle and welcoming smile. She approached the bed quickly, placing the clipboard on the nearby table and checking the monitors with practical and efficient movements. Her hands touched Charles's forehead, measuring his temperature, then checked his pulse at the left wrist. There was something maternal in her gestures, a tenderness that made Charles want to cry again. It had been so long since someone had touched him with genuine concern and care that he barely remembered what it was like to receive simple and selfless human affection. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitmore. You gave us a huge scare, but you made it through the surgery," she said, her voice soft and comforting as she adjusted the pillow behind his head. Charles tried to smile in gratitude, but his lips trembled and unexpected tears began to form in his eyes. "How long have I been asleep?" asked Charles, his voice breaking in the middle of the sentence. Each word required effort, his throat still sore from tubes that had been inserted during surgery. The nurse picked up a cup with water and brought a straw to his lips, allowing him to drink a few sips before answering. The cold water went down his throat, alleviating some of the discomfort but not completely eliminating the rough sensation. She put the cup back on the table and pulled up a chair, sitting down beside the bed in a gesture that Charles appreciated immensely. It meant she wasn't in a hurry to leave, that she was willing to dedicate a few minutes of her time to talk to him as a human being, not just as a bed number. The surgery was yesterday morning. You stayed in post-operative recovery for a few hours and then were brought here. It's almost 4 in the afternoon now, she explained, checking the clock on the wall as she spoke. Charles processed that information slowly, trying to calculate how many hours had passed since the doors of the operating room had closed behind him. More than 24 hours, Charles murmured, feeling disoriented by the loss of time. It was as if pieces of his life were being torn away without his permission, hours and days disappearing into a black void that he couldn't remember or recover. He looked at the window, seeing the sunlight filtered through the curtains, and tried to anchor himself to that present moment. He was alive. That was the most important thing. He had survived a surgery that the doctor himself had said had significant chances of failure. Perhaps this meant there was still hope, that the universe or God or whatever higher power existed was giving him a second chance to fix the mistakes he had made. He thought of Victoria again, as he always did in moments of greatest emotional vulnerability. His daughter was somewhere, living a life he knew nothing about, and he had to find her before it was too late. "Where is Dr. Hayes?" "I need to talk to him about when I can leave here," said Charles, trying to sound stronger than he actually felt, although his voice still trembled with weakness. The nurse exchanged a glance with someone else who had entered the room silently while they were talking. Charles turned his head with difficulty and saw Dr. Hayes standing near the door, wearing his impeccable white coat, but with an expression that immediately made Charles nervous. It wasn't the expression of someone bringing good news. The doctor slowly approached the bed, his hands in the pockets of his coat, and Charles could see tension in his shoulders, a rigidity that wasn't present before. The nurse discreetly stood up, making room for the doctor, but remained in the room, positioning herself near the window as if she sensed her presence might be necessary. Dr. Hayes pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, crossing his hands over his lap, in a gesture that Charles already recognized as the prelude to difficult conversations. Heavy silence filled the room for a few seconds, only the soft beeping of the monitors marking the passage of time. "Mr. Whitmore, the surgery was technically successful. We managed to do the revascularization we needed to do," the doctor began, but his voice carried a weight that suggested there was a big but coming next. Charles felt his stomach sink, a terrible premonition forming in his chest like a cold, heavy stone. He knew that tone of voice, had used variations of it himself throughout his career when he needed to give bad news to partners or employees. It was the tone of someone who is about to destroy hopes, but tries to do it in the gentlest way possible. He clutched the sheet with his hands, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. Dr. Hayes took a deep breath before continuing, choosing his words with obvious care. Charles could see the internal struggle on the doctor's face, the conflict between the duty to be honest and the human desire to spare his patient additional suffering. The nurse by the window had crossed her arms, her expression also showing anticipated sadness. "But your heart suffered very extensive damage during the initial heart attack, Mr. Whitmore. Damage that we cannot reverse no matter how many surgeries we perform," said the doctor, pausing to let those words settle before continuing. Charles closed his eyes, feeling hot tears pressing against his eyelids as he tried to process what he was hearing. "What does that mean exactly, doctor?" Charles forced himself to ask, although part of him didn't want to hear the answer. He opened his eyes again, staring directly at the doctor, demanding complete honesty even if it was brutal. There was no point in living in denial or false hopes anymore. He needed to know the truth, however painful it might be, to make decisions about the time he had left. Dr. Hayes held his gaze, respecting that need for direct honesty. There was a deep sadness in the doctor's eyes, the kind of sadness that comes from having to give the same terminal diagnosis repeatedly throughout a career, knowing that each time means the end of someone's life. He uncrossed his hands and placed them on his knees, leaning slightly forward. "It means that despite the surgery, your heart remains very weak. It's not pumping blood properly. We can control the symptoms with medication, temporarily improve your quality of life, but..." He hesitated, and Charles saw something break in the doctor's professional composure. "But I'm going to die anyway," Charles completed, saying out loud what the doctor was trying to prepare himself to say. It wasn't a question, It was a statement of fact. The confirmation came in the silence that followed, more eloquent than any word could be. Dr. Hayes nodded slowly, his expression heavy with compassion and regret. Charles felt something collapse inside him, all the hopes he had built in the last few hours shattering like glass against concrete. He had survived the surgery, had fought against all odds, and yet it wouldn't be enough. Death was still waiting for him, merely postponed by a few months instead of a few days. He thought of Victoria, of his granddaughter who probably existed somewhere, of all the conversations they would never have, all the hugs they would never share, all the lost years they could never recover. "How much time do I have?" he asked, his voice coming out surprisingly firm despite the tears flowing freely down his face. He needed to know how much time he had to try to fix the unfixable, to try to find his daughter before it was too late. Dr. Hayes adjusted his glasses in a nervous gesture before responding, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question, but respecting Charles's need to know. He glanced briefly at the nurse as if seeking some kind of moral support, before turning his attention back to Charles. The afternoon light coming through the window created soft shadows in the room, giving the moment an almost surreal quality, as if they were existing in a space suspended between life and the inevitability of death. "It is hard to say with absolute certainty, Mr. Whitmore. Each patient responds differently, but based on the current state of your heart and the damage we observed, I would say you have between 3 to 6 months, perhaps a little more if we're lucky, and you follow all medical recommendations rigorously," replied the doctor, his voice becoming softer with each word, as if trying to soften the impact of the death sentence he had just pronounced. Charles felt the room spin slightly around him, the reality of those words hitting him with full force. 3 to 6 months. 90 to 180 days to find Victoria, to ask for forgiveness, to meet his granddaughter, to try to be the father he should have been from the beginning. It seemed at once an eternity and absolutely nothing. How many days had he wasted throughout his life in meaningless meetings, chasing money that now meant nothing, building an empire that would die with him, and now he had only a few months to do what he should have done decades ago. The injustice of it hit him like a punch to the stomach, making him bend slightly in bed, despite the pain the movement caused in his operated chest. The nurse stepped forward concerned, but Charles raised his trembling hand to indicate that he was fine, or at least as fine as someone could be after receiving a death sentence. 3 to 6 months, he repeated in a low voice, letting those words echo in the silent room. "It's not enough time. I need more time. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. I really wish I could give you different news," said Dr. Hayes, and Charles could hear the genuine sincerity in his voice. The doctor placed his hand on Charles's shoulder in a gesture of comfort, and for a few moments they remained like this, two men united by that moment of shared pain. The nurse approached as well, offering a tissue so Charles could dry the tears that wouldn't stop flowing. He accepted gratefully, cleaning his face with mechanical movements while trying to gather strength to ask the next question. There was something he needed to know, something that had been on his mind since he woke up in that empty room. He looked around again, confirming what he already knew. There was no one besides the healthcare professionals. No visitors, no family, no friends. He was alone as he had always been, but now that loneliness seemed more painful and definitive than ever. "Did no one come to see me? Not even my secretary? No one asked about me?" Charles questioned, although he already knew the answer in his heart. Dr. Hayes and the nurse exchanged an uncomfortable look, neither wanting to be the bearer of more bad news. It was the nurse who finally answered, her voice soft and gentle, trying to soften the cruelty of the truth. She sat on the edge of the bed, an informal gesture that broke hospital protocols, but offered a human comfort that Charles desperately needed at that moment. She took his hand between hers, those hands calloused from years of dedicated care to countless patients, and held firmly. "Those 3 men in suits came back yesterday, right after the surgery. They stayed for a few minutes, asked about the procedure's outcome, but left when the doctor said you would take hours to wake up," she explained, hesitating before continuing. "They left some documents at the reception, saying they were urgent and that you should sign them as soon as possible. But they didn't come back after that, and there was no one else." Charles closed his eyes, feeling those words cut deeper than any surgical scalpel could have. Throughout his entire life, he had surrounded himself with people who were there for the money, the power, the opportunities he could offer. He had never cultivated true friendships, never allowed anyone to get close enough to see him as a human being instead of a business asset. And now when he was dying, when he needed companionship and emotional support the most, he was completely alone. There was no one to hold his hand besides a nurse paid to care for him. There was no one to cry for him, to miss him when he was gone, to carry his memory forward. He had built an empire but was dying in total solitude, a king without a kingdom that truly mattered, a rich man but emotionally bankrupt. "I wasted my entire life," he murmured, opening his eyes and letting tears flow freely without trying to hide them anymore. "I built an empire for nobody. I accumulated fortunes that won't save me, and I pushed away the only person I truly loved." "Your daughter, Victoria," said the nurse softly, remembering the name Charles had repeatedly murmured before surgery. She squeezed his hand more firmly, offering the only comfort she could, her human presence and genuine compassion. Charles nodded, unable to speak for a moment as emotions engulfed him like violent waves. Dr. Hayes remained seated in silence, allowing Charles to process everything at his own pace, not rushing or trying to fill the silence with empty words of comfort. There was dignity in that shared silence, an acknowledgement that some pains are too deep to be eased with well-intentioned phrases. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, Charles finally regained enough composure to speak again. His voice came out determined, carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "I need to get out of here, Doctor. I need to find my daughter before it's too late," declared Charles, beginning to try to sit up in bed despite the sharp pain the movement caused. The nurse immediately tried to make him lie down again, her hands gentle but firm on his shoulders, while Dr. Hayes rose from his chair with an alarmed expression. They exchanged worried glances, clearly not expecting that reaction. The doctor quickly approached, positioning himself on the other side of the bed and helping the nurse keep Charles lying down, without causing more damage to his fragile and recently operated body. Charles fought against them for a few seconds before realizing he was too weak to win that battle. His body simply didn't obey his mind's commands, too exhausted after surgery and too weakened by disease. He gave up, falling back against the pillows with a frustrated groan. But his determination hadn't diminished, just his physical ability to act on it. "Mr. Whitmore, you've just undergone extremely delicate heart surgery. Your body needs time to recover, even if just a little," argued Dr. Hayes, his voice carrying both medical authority and genuine concern. "Time is exactly what I don't have, Doctor," exploded Charles, his voice gaining a desperate intensity that made both the doctor and nurse take a step back. He tried to sit up again, this time more carefully, using his arms for support while ignoring the pain shooting across his chest. Each movement was agony, but he was determined not to remain lying down and helpless any longer. Dr. Hayes seemed about to protest again, but something in Charles's expression made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the naked, raw desperation in his eyes, or perhaps it was the recognition that a man with months to live had the right to choose how to spend his final days, even if those choices were medically questionable. The nurse adjusted the pillows behind Charles's back, helping him achieve a semi-seated position that was less stressful for his heart than being completely upright. "You just told me I have only a few months to live. Each day I spend trapped in this bed is one less day I have to find my daughter, to ask for forgiveness, to try to fix what I destroyed," Charles continued, his voice breaking but maintaining that iron determination. Dr. Hayes sighed deeply, removing his glasses and rubbing his face with his hands in a gesture of frustration and fatigue. He put his glasses back on and looked at Charles with a mixture of reluctant admiration and medical concern. It was clear that he understood the emotional urgency driving his patient, but was also caught between his professional duty to protect Charles's health and the recognition that quality of life was sometimes more important than quantity. The nurse remained nearby, her hands hovering close to Charles in case he needed support, her expression showing similar conflict. Tense silence filled the room again as the doctor clearly struggled with the decision he needed to make. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke in a careful, measured voice. "If I let you leave against my medical recommendations, you need to understand the risks. Your heart is extremely fragile." Any physical exertion, any significant emotional stress could cause another cardiac arrest. And this time, there may not be anyone around to resuscitate you, warned the doctor, his voice carrying the weight of medical responsibility and human concern. I understand the risks, doctor, and I accept them, Charles responded without hesitation, his voice firm despite the fear he certainly felt. He knew he was making a potentially suicidal decision, that leaving the hospital in that state could mean dying much sooner than the 3 to 6 months he had been given. But he also knew that spending those months lying in a hospital bed, waiting for death while Victoria remained lost and unreachable, would be torture worse than any physical death. He needed to try. He needed to use every minute he had left to seek redemption, even if that search killed him in the process. Dr. Hayes studied his face for a long moment, looking for signs of irrationality or decisions made under the influence of medications or emotional shock. But what he saw was clear and conscious determination, the resolution of a man who had made a final decision about how he wanted to spend his last days. All right, the doctor finally conceded, although his voice carried clear reluctance. But I'm going to prescribe medications that you need to take religiously, and I'll give detailed instructions about warning signs that require immediate medical attention. Charles nodded gratefully, feeling a wave of relief mixed with terror as he realized he was really going to do this. He was going to leave the relative safety of the hospital and venture out into the world in search of a daughter he hadn't seen in 15 years, who could be anywhere, who might not even want to see him. It was a possibly impossible mission that he needed to undertake anyway. The nurse began helping him out of bed slowly, supporting his weight as his feet touched the cold floor for the first time in days. His legs trembled dangerously, threatening to give out completely, but he clutched the edge of the bed and forced himself to stand. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain and continued. Dr. Hayes watched everything with a worried expression, ready to intervene if Charles collapsed. "I'll need clothes, and I need someone to get my driver," said Charles, his breathing already becoming laborious just from the effort of standing. The world spun slightly around him, but he blinked several times and forced his vision to stabilize through sheer willpower. It took almost an hour to prepare Charles to leave the hospital. The nurse helped him dress in clothes that someone had brought from his home, probably his secretary fulfilling an administrative order. It was strange to wear a suit again after days in hospital gowns, as if he were putting on armor that no longer fit him properly. The clothes seemed to hang on his emaciated body, reminding him of how much weight he had lost in such a short time. Dr. Hayes spent long minutes explaining each medication, when to take them, what side effects to expect, which symptoms meant immediate danger. Charles tried to pay attention, but his mind was already outside in the city streets looking for Victoria. Finally, after signing multiple forms taking responsibility for his own decision to leave against medical recommendations, Charles was ready to depart. A wheelchair was brought, hospital protocol for patients being released, and Charles had no energy to protest. He allowed himself to be pushed through the corridors, passing by other patients and visitors who barely noticed him. "Good luck, Mr. Whitmore. I really hope you find your daughter," said Dr. Hayes when they reached the parking lot, his voice carrying genuine sincerity while shaking Charles's hand one last time. The driver was waiting beside the luxury car, a gleaming black sedan that represented status and wealth, but now seemed just like any other vehicle. The man, a middle-aged employee who had worked for Charles for years, but whose name he embarrassingly couldn't remember, opened the back door with professional efficiency. His face showed shock at seeing his employer's debilitated state, but he quickly composed his expression into trained neutrality. Charles accepted the nurse's help to get out of the wheelchair and into the car, each movement being a careful negotiation between his determined will and his fragile body. The car's interior smelled of expensive leather and meticulous cleaning, a sharp contrast to the hospital odors that had filled his world in recent days. He sank into the soft seat, feeling his body immediately relax against the luxurious upholstery. The door closed with a muffled, refined sound, isolating him from the outside world. "Where are we going, Mr. Whitmore?" asked the driver, adjusting the rearview mirror while smoothly starting the engine. Charles remained silent for a long moment, looking through the darkened window at the hospital building being left behind. He saw Dr. Hayes and the nurse still standing at the entrance, watching his departure with concerned expressions. He felt a wave of gratitude for those people who had cared for him with such dedication, who had fought for his life even when the odds were against them. He raised his hand in a farewell gesture, not knowing if they could see him through the darkened glass, but needing to make the gesture anyway. Then he turned forward, facing the unknown path that stretched before him. Where to go? How to begin searching for someone who had disappeared 15 years ago? He had no address, no phone number, no concrete clues, just a name and painful memories of their last encounter. "I don't know," admitted Charles, his voice coming out weak and uncertain. "Just drive through the city streets, through the older neighborhoods where she used to volunteer when she was young." The driver nodded without asking questions, accepting the strange instructions with the same professional discretion that characterized all of Charles's employees. The car began to move smoothly, gliding through the busy city streets as the afternoon sun painted everything in golden tones. Charles watched through the window, his eyes scanning every face on the sidewalks, every corner, every alley, looking for something he wasn't even sure he would be able to recognize. How would Victoria look now? She would be 35, no longer the 20-year-old he had thrown out of his house. She would have changed, aged, perhaps looked more like her deceased mother. What if he passed her on the street without recognizing her? What if she saw him but walked away, refusing to speak to the father who had rejected her when she needed him most? The weight of these uncertainties pressed on his chest like heavy stones, making his already labored breathing even more difficult. "Sir, are you all right? You look very pale," observed the driver, looking through the rearview mirror with evident concern in his voice. "I'm fine," lied Charles, although he knew the driver didn't believe him. He could feel his heart beating irregularly in his chest, skipping occasional beats that made him give small starts. The medication he had taken before leaving the hospital was taking effect, but it wasn't enough to completely eliminate the constant discomfort. He brought his hand to his chest, pressing lightly over his suit as if he could manually calm his rebellious heart. The streets passed in a blur of movement and color, pedestrians coming and going in their everyday lives, completely oblivious to the personal drama unfolding inside that luxury car. Charles thought how strange it was that the world continued turning normally while his own life was falling apart, as if his personal tragedy was too insignificant to deserve even a pause in the universal routine. "Please, God," he whispered, surprising himself with his own words. He hadn't prayed in decades, had moved away from any kind of faith or spirituality so long ago that he thought he had forgotten how. "Please give me some clue. Show me where to find her, I beg you." The car continued traveling the streets for more than 2 hours, winding through neighborhoods that Charles barely recognized. They passed through areas that used to be prosperous residential neighborhoods, but now showed signs of decline and abandonment. They passed parks where children played under the supervision of attentive parents. They passed corners where groups of young people gathered, talking and laughing with the carefree attitude of youth. But no face seemed familiar, no figure triggered recognition. Charles felt growing despair tightening his throat with each passing minute, without success. Perhaps Victoria was no longer in the city. Perhaps she had moved to another state, or even another country. Perhaps she was dead, taken by some tragedy he never learned about because he had cut all ties with her. This thought was too unbearable to contemplate for long. "Let's go to the area near the river," Charles suddenly said, remembering something Victoria had mentioned decades ago. "I feel in my heart that I must go there," he said, not quite understanding where that idea came from. The driver changed direction, navigating the streets with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the city. They went to increasingly degraded areas where abandoned buildings alternated with small businesses struggling to survive. Daylight was beginning to fade, the sky acquiring shades of orange and pink as the sun approached the horizon. Charles felt growing urgency, as if time was running out faster than it should. His heart was beating harder now, not just because of his illness, but also from the anxiety that his search might be fruitless. They finally reached an area near the river where an old bridge crossed the dark waters. It was a structure of stained concrete, covered in graffiti, and obviously neglected by the authorities. Under the bridge, Charles could see shadows and indistinct shapes, suggesting people living in precarious conditions. "Stop here," Charles ordered, his voice suddenly tense and urgent. Something in his chest tightened, an inexplicable intuition that he needed to be there. "Sir, this is not a safe area. Perhaps it would be better to continue searching elsewhere," suggested the driver, his voice carrying genuine concern as he observed the surroundings through the windows. There was garbage accumulated on the sidewalks, ragged people moving slowly like shadows among the decaying structures. It was the kind of place people like Charles normally avoided, the invisible underworld that existed on the margins of prosperous society. But Charles wasn't listening. Something was pulling him to that place, a force he couldn't explain rationally but felt in every fiber of his being. He opened the car door before it had even completely stopped, ignoring the alarmed protest of the driver. The abrupt movement sent a wave of dizziness through his head, making the world spin dangerously for a few seconds. He clutched the car door, waiting for his vision to stabilize, breathing deeply despite the pain each inhalation caused. "I need to check under that bridge. Stay here with the car," Charles said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He began walking toward the bridge, each step requiring conscious concentration and immense effort. His legs were shaking, threatening to give out at any moment, but he forced one leg in front of the other through pure determination. The uneven ground beneath his expensive and impractical shoes made each step a risky adventure. He could hear the driver getting out of the car behind him, probably debating whether to follow his employer or obey the orders to stay with the vehicle. Charles continued moving forward, descending the slope that led down under the bridge. There was an unpleasant odor in the air, a mixture of garbage, dampness, and human desperation that made his stomach turn. He passed an elderly man wrapped in torn blankets who observed him with empty and indifferent eyes. He passed a group of young people talking in low voices, stopping to stare at him with mixed expressions of curiosity and hostility as they saw his expensive clothes. "Please, God," Charles muttered again, his prayers becoming more desperate with each second. "Show me a sign, anything." And then he saw her. Sitting on the dirty concrete floor, leaning against one of the bridge pillars, was a young woman who made Charles's heart almost stop. She was disheveled, dirty, and torn clothes hanging from her too thin body. Her hair was tangled and lifeless, falling around a face that showed marks of suffering and deprivation. There was a purple bruise on her left cheek, old scars on her exposed arms. She was sitting on old newspapers, hugging her knees against her chest as she cried silently, her entire body shaking with muffled sobs. But it was his face that had frozen Charles in place, completely paralyzing him. Those brown eyes, that chin shape, that delicate curve of the eyebrows, it was Victoria, or at least it was exactly how Victoria looked when she was 20, before everything crumbled between them. The resemblance was so shocking, so impossible, that Charles felt his legs finally give way. "It can't be," he whispered, falling to his knees on the dirty floor without even feeling the impact. The young woman looked up at the sound, startled by the sudden presence of a stranger. Her pupils dilated with fear, and she cowered even more against the pillar, like a cornered animal preparing to flee or fight. Charles raised his hands in a gesture of peace, trying to show that he posed no threat despite tears already streaming freely down his face. He crawled a few inches closer, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. Now that he was closer, he could see more details. She was young, probably in her early 20s, much too young to be Victoria, but old enough to be the granddaughter. The thought hit Charles like lightning, illuminating his mind with sudden and devastating clarity. This young woman, this suffering child living on the streets like an abandoned animal, could be his granddaughter, Victoria's daughter. The child he had indirectly condemned to this miserable existence when he had thrown her pregnant mother out of the house so many years ago. "Victoria," he managed to say, his voice broken and almost inaudible. "Victoria, it's me, your father." The young woman stared at him with obvious confusion, her eyes red from crying fixed on his face, as if trying to process who this well-dressed man was, crying on his knees on the dirty floor. She said nothing for a long moment, just continued to observe him with that mixed expression of fear and perplexity. Charles reached out a trembling hand toward her, a pleading gesture that carried decades of regret and pain. He could see his own reflection in her brown eyes, an old and broken man, pathetic in his desperation. All his wealth, all his power, everything he had built over a lifetime amounted to nothing in that moment. He was just a lost father looking for the daughter he had abandoned, or perhaps for the granddaughter he had never known. "Please," he begged, his voice gaining urgency as more tears fell. "Please, tell me, are you Victoria? Or are you her daughter?" His breathing was becoming increasingly labored, his heart beating so irregularly that he could feel each erratic palpitation echoing through his fragile chest. The young woman finally spoke, her voice coming out hoarse and tired, carrying a weight that no person so young should carry. There was an ancient sadness in her tone, a resignation that came from years of suffering and disappointment. She didn't move from her huddled position against the pillar, maintaining a cautious distance between herself and this tearful stranger. Her hands gripped her own knees more tightly, as if that was the only solid thing in a world that constantly crumbled around her. Giles could see fresh tears beginning to form in the corners of her eyes, mixing with the old tears that had left clean trails on her dirty face. "I'm not Victoria," she said slowly, each word coming out with difficulty as if it were being forcibly pulled from her throat. "My name is Amber Whitmore. I am Victoria's daughter." She paused, swallowing with difficulty as more tears ran down her face. Giles felt a wave of emotion so intense that he thought his heart would finally give way completely. It was her, his granddaughter. The living proof that Victoria had existed had continued living after that devastating separation. "Amber," Giles repeated, testing the name on his tongue, feeling its weight and beauty. His granddaughter. He had a granddaughter, a connection to Victoria that he thought he had lost forever. He crawled a bit closer, ignoring the pain that shot through his knees against the rough concrete, ignoring the protests of his exhausted body. All that mattered was the young woman before him, that child who carried Victoria's blood, who had Victoria's eyes, who was all that remained of the daughter he had lost. "Amber, I am your grandfather." "I am Victoria's father." He stopped, realizing how empty those words sounded. What would he have done, the same selfish choices he had always made? He shook his head, tears falling so quickly now that he could barely see through them. "Where is Victoria? Where is your mother? I need to see her. I need to ask her forgiveness." There was so much desperation in his voice, such urgent need, that even Amber seemed touched despite her obvious mistrust. Amber watched him in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Giles could see emotions crossing her face like shadows. Confusion, anger, sadness, and something that might be compassion, or perhaps just pity for the pathetic old man crying at her feet. She wiped the tears from her own face with the back of her hand, leaving smudges of dirt on her pale skin. Her eyes, those brown eyes so similar to Victoria's, fixed on Charles's with an intensity that made him tremble. There was a decision being made behind those eyes, a calculation about how much to reveal to this stranger who claimed to be her grandfather. Giles waited, holding his breath despite the pain it caused, afraid that any movement or word might break this fragile moment and make Amber flee forever. Finally, she opened her mouth to speak, and Charles prepared himself to hear where to find Victoria, how to reunite with his daughter after 15 lost years. But the words that came out of Amber's mouth were not what he expected. "She's dead." The 3 words fell between them like bombs, exploding in the air with devastating force that left only silence and destruction in their wake. Charles felt as if he had been hit in the chest with a hammer, all air being expelled from his lungs in a single violent moment. The world around him seemed to freeze, every sound disappearing into an absolute vacuum. He couldn't process what he had heard, his brain refusing to accept those impossible words. Victoria couldn't be dead. She couldn't. He had survived the surgery, had left the hospital against all recommendations, had prayed and begged for a clue, and God had guided him here. There had to be hope. There had to be a chance for redemption. But as he looked into Amber's sad eyes, seeing the brutal truth reflected in them, something broke inside Charles in a way that no heart attack had ever managed to break. His daughter was dead. Victoria was dead. And he would never have the chance to ask for forgiveness, could never undo the cruel words, could never hug her and tell her that he had always loved her, even when he had been unable to show it. A strange sound escaped from Charles's throat, something between a moan and a scream, primitive and filled with pain. He brought his hands to his chest, feeling the unbearable weight of the pain consuming him. Unable to contain his tears, he let himself fall to his knees, overwhelmed by emotion and regret. Each breath was a battle, each heartbeat an agony. Amber watched everything with a complicated expression, a mixture of pity, anger, and her own sadness. She had just destroyed this man's world with 3 simple words, and Charles could see that it also hurt her, that she hadn't said it with cruelty, but only with the brutal honesty of someone who had no more energy to soften painful truths. "When?" Charles finally managed to ask, his voice coming out strangled and almost unrecognizable. "When did she die?" He raised his face to look at Amber, and there was so much desperation in his expression that she had to look away. 3 years ago," Amber answered, her own voice breaking as she spoke. Tears began to roll down her face again, clean trails through the dirt. "She got sick, very sick, but she had no money for good doctors or hospitals. We tried going to the public health center, but there were always huge lines, and when we finally got care, it was too late." Her voice became more bitter with each word, years of anger and injustice bubbling to the surface. "She died in a public hospital hallway, waiting for a bed that never appeared. I was holding her hand. She was in pain, so much pain, and I couldn't do anything but sit there watching." Amber covered her face with her hands, her entire body trembling with the force of her emotions. Charles felt a guilt so crushing that he thought it would bury him alive. 3 years. Victoria had died 3 years ago, alone except for her daughter in a public hospital, while he lived in mansions and signed million-dollar contracts. "No," moaned Charles, the word coming out like a lament. "No, no, no." He repeated it like a mantra, as if he could undo reality through pure denial. His mind spun out of control, trying to process information that was simply impossible to accept. Victoria had gone through so much suffering, so much pain, and he hadn't been there. He had never looked for her, never tried to fix what he had broken, never offered her the help that his money and resources could have easily provided. And now it was too late, eternally too late. She was gone, taken by an illness that probably could have been treated if she had had access to adequate medical care, if he hadn't thrown her out of the house without resources. If he hadn't been so cruel, so proud, so blind in his anger. "It was my fault," he whispered, the truth of those words cutting like glass. "I killed her. I killed my own daughter." His heart was beating dangerously irregular now, sharp pains crossing his chest in increasingly intense waves. Amber lowered her hands, revealing a face stained with tears and dirt. She looked at Charles with an expression too complex to fully decipher. There was anger there, yes, anger toward this man whom Victoria had occasionally mentioned with such pain, this father who had rejected her when she needed him most. But there was also something that could be understanding, or at least recognition, that his suffering now was genuine, that his pain wasn't feigned or performative. "She never stopped loving you," Amber suddenly said, the words coming out low but clear in the cold air under the bridge. "Even after everything you did, all the terrible things you said to her, she never stopped. She said you were hurt, that you didn't know how to express love, that one day maybe you would understand." More tears ran down her face. "She died waiting for you to come looking for her, died waiting for you to forgive her for disappointing you." The absurdity of that last sentence hit Charles with renewed force. Victoria had died thinking that she needed forgiveness from him, when it was he who needed to kneel and beg for her forgiveness. Charles could no longer support his own weight. He collapsed to the side, overcome by pain and emotion, feeling the weight of regret consuming him from within. He had lost everything. Victoria was dead. His only daughter, the only person he had truly loved in his entire empty and lonely life, had been dead for 3 years, and he hadn't even known. He had continued living, doing business, accumulating more useless wealth while she suffered and died without him. And now he could never say he was sorry, could never hug her, could never be the father he should have been. "Victoria," he cried, his body convulsing with sobs that tore at his throat. "My girl, forgive me, please forgive me." He repeated the words like a desperate prayer, knowing that she would never hear them, that it was too late for any plea for forgiveness to make a difference. Amber watched the old man completely crumble before her, and something changed in her expression. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother talking about him with that persistent sadness. Perhaps it was simple human compassion in the face of such suffering. She moved for the first time since the conversation began, dragging herself across the floor until she was closer to Charles. Hesitantly, she stretched out her hand and touched his trembling shoulder, a small but significant gesture of human connection. Charles felt that touch and grabbed her hand desperately, holding it as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. She was all that remained of Victoria. This suffering and frightened young woman was the only connection he still had with his daughter. "I'm sorry," Amber said softly, her own voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry you never had the chance to say goodbye to her. She would have liked to see you even after everything. She would have forgiven you." Those words, meant to comfort, only intensified Charles's agony because he knew he had never deserved that forgiveness. Charles smiled with difficulty, tears flowing freely down his face as he held Amber's trembling hands. Each breath was an immense effort, his chest tightening alarmingly, but he needed to say those words before it was too late. He looked deeply into her brown eyes, those eyes that so reminded him of Victoria, and gathered all the strength that remained in his broken body. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began, his voice coming out weak but determined. "But I can't leave without you knowing the truth." He paused, breathing with effort, feeling his heart fail and stumble in his chest. "Your mother, Victoria, she was everything to me. Everything. And I lost her through pride, through selfishness, because I was a man too hard to show love." More tears fell, his voice breaking. "I wasted 15 years that I could have spent with her, and now it's too late." He extended his trembling hand toward Amber, gently touching her dirty, tear-stained face. The touch was delicate, full of all the affection he had never managed to express to Victoria when he had the chance. "You are all that remains of her, Amber," he said, his voice gaining urgency even as it weakened. "You are my granddaughter, my blood, the only family I have left in this world." He squeezed her hand with all the strength he could gather, which wasn't much but carried the intensity of a lifetime of repressed emotions. "And I won't abandon you again. I promise. Even if I die right here at this very moment, you need to know one thing." He paused, gathering strength for the most important words he would say in his entire life. "I love you, Amber. I love you even though I've just met you. I love you because you're part of Victoria, and I won't let you suffer alone for one more day." His body shook violently, the pain in his chest becoming unbearable. The words hung in the cold air under the bridge, echoing in the silent space. Amber stood completely still for a moment, her eyes wide and fixed on Charles's face. She seemed to be processing something deep, something she had never expected to hear or feel in her difficult and lonely life. Tears began to flow more quickly down her face, leaving clean trails through the accumulated dirt. Her lower lip trembled, and then, as if a dam had broken inside her, she completely fell apart. A loud, painful sob escaped her throat, followed by another and another. She fell to her knees and hugged Charles with desperate force, her skinny body shaking with the intensity of her emotions. Charles wrapped her in his weak arms, holding her against his chest despite the sharp pain the movement caused. They stayed like this, grandfather and granddaughter meeting for the first time under the most unlikely circumstances, crying together for everything that had been lost, and for this unexpected connection that was being born between them. "I forgive you, Grandpa," sobbed Amber against his shoulder, the words coming out muffled but clear and sincere. "I forgive you for everything. Just don't die now, please. Don't leave me alone again." Charles tried to respond, tried to promise that he would stay with her, but suddenly he couldn't find enough air to form words. His chest tightened violently, a sharp and familiar pain radiating from the center, in increasingly intense waves that stole all his strength. "No," he thought with growing panic. "Not now. Not when I've finally found something to live for." He tried to hold on to Amber, tried to stay conscious through sheer force of will, but his body was beyond the control of his mind. His hands began to slip from her shoulders, his muscles losing all strength in a quick and frightening way. Darkness began to invade the edges of his vision, narrowing the world until all he could see was Amber's frightened face, very close to his. "Grandpa! Grandpa!" he heard her scream, but her voice sounded increasingly distant, as if he was being pulled away through a dark tunnel. His eyes began to close against his will, the darkness finally winning his desperate struggle to remain conscious. "I'm sorry," he thought as he let himself sink, feeling his body begin to completely collapse in her arms. Amber felt Charles's weight suddenly increase against her, his entire body becoming inert and heavy. Her eyes widened in horror when she realized what was happening. She held him more tightly, trying to keep him upright, but he was too heavy, and she too weak. They fell together onto the concrete, Amber cushioning the fall with her own body. She quickly turned him over, laying him on his back, and then saw with terror that his eyes were closed, his face pale as paper, his lips beginning to turn bluish. She tried to call him, her voice overcome with desperation. "Please stay with me," she pleaded, feeling the fear of losing him again. She shook his shoulders, but he didn't respond. Absolute panic took over her, that feeling of overwhelming helplessness she knew so well from when she had watched her mother die. "Help!" she screamed into the empty night, her voice breaking with despair. "Someone help me, please!" But there was no one, just the cruel silence of the early morning. Amber hugged Charles's inert body against her chest, rocking back and forth while tears fell onto his pale face. Her mind spun uncontrollably, trying to think of something, anything she could do, but she had never had anyone to teach her about emergencies. The injustice of it, the cruelty of finally finding family only to lose it immediately, was too much to bear. She closed her eyes tightly, more tears streaming down, and for the first time in years, since her mother had died and she had lost all faith, Amber did something she had sworn never to do again. She prayed. "Please," she whispered, her voice broken and desperate, trembling in the cold air. "Please, God, if you're there, if you care about people like me, don't take him from me now, not after I finally found someone. I beg you, I beg." She held Charles's body more tightly, as if she could keep him tied to life through the strength of her will and love. "Don't let him die, please." Silence answered her prayer initially, only the distant sounds of the night city echoing from afar. Amber continued holding Charles, feeling his body getting colder and colder, and was about to give up when she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly raised her head, seeing a figure emerge from the shadows under the bridge. It was an old man, very old, with disheveled white hair and beard, clothes as old and worn as hers, but with kind eyes that shone even in the dimness. Amber recognized him immediately. It was the old homeless man who had always been kind to her, who occasionally shared food when he had it, who never tried to hurt her. He always talked about God and faith with a serene conviction that Amber never fully understood. "Help!" she called, her voice coming out desperate and high-pitched. "Please, he's dying. I don't know what to do." The old man approached calmly, unhurried despite the urgency of the situation, as if he completely trusted that everything would happen in God's right time. "Calm down, child," he said, his voice hoarse but gentle. "God didn't bring you two this far to end like this. Help me carry him. I know someone who can save him." Together, with considerable difficulty, they managed to lift Charles's inert body. He moaned softly, a sound that made Amber's heart leap with fragile hope. He was still alive, still fighting. They walked several blocks that felt like miles, carrying Charles between them, Amber feeling her muscles burn but not giving up. Finally, the old man stopped in front of a small, modest house. There was a light on in one window. "It's here," said the old man, climbing the steps. "Doctor," he called, knocking on the door. "Doctor, it's an emergency. We need help." The door opened, revealing a man of about 60, with graying hair and glasses. When he saw unconscious Charles, he didn't hesitate. "Bring him to the treatment room, quickly," he said, opening the door completely. "Back there." They entered and found a room with a medical stretcher and equipment. "Put him here," instructed the doctor, already turning on machines. "Quickly." Immediately, the doctor acted swiftly, initiating emergency procedures while trying to stabilize Charles's heartbeat. "He had recent heart surgery," muttered the doctor, "and he's in cardiac arrest." He pulled medications and syringes, working rapidly. "When did this happen?" he asked while preparing injections. "About 20 minutes ago," Amber answered, her voice trembling. "He was talking to me and suddenly collapsed." The doctor administered several injections, adjusted the oxygen, checked the monitor repeatedly. Minutes crawled by like hours. Amber watched with wide eyes, barely daring to breathe. The old man remained by her side, lips moving in silent prayer. "It's not possible," the doctor suddenly muttered, looking at the monitor with disbelief. "This shouldn't be working." "What's happening?" asked Amber, her voice small and frightened, clinging to any hope. The doctor continued observing the monitor, checked Charles's pulse again, placed the stethoscope on his chest. When he raised his eyes, there were tears in them. "He's stabilized," he said, his voice laden with emotion and amazement. "I don't know how, but he's stabilized. His heart is beating more regularly now. The levels are improving rapidly." He looked at the old man, who was smiling serenely. It was very close. Very, very close. He was in critical condition when he arrived, but he responded unexpectedly, defying all odds. He shook his head, incredulous. But something happened, something that medicine can't explain. His heart responded to the medications in a way that isn't normal, not with these damages. He wiped tears from his own eyes. Perhaps love, perhaps grace. Who am I to say? Amber let out a sob of relief, her legs giving way. She fell to her knees beside the stretcher, grabbing Charles's hand and pressing it against her face as she cried. Charles began to move slightly, his fingers contracting. His eyes flickered, trying to focus. "Grandpa," called Amber. "Can you hear me? You came back." Charles made a low sound, his eyes opening. When they rested on Amber, recognition lit in them. "Amber," he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. "Are you all right?" Amber laughed through tears. "I'm fine, Grandpa." "You're fine. You came back to me." Charles squeezed her hand weakly. "I promised I wouldn't abandon you," he said, his voice firm despite the weakness. The doctor approached, still visibly moved. "You were very lucky, sir. Your heart should have stopped completely, but something brought you back." The old man approached. "It was love and faith. This girl prayed for you, and God answered." Charles tried to sit up, and the doctor carefully helped him, supporting his back with pillows. The movement caused dizziness, but it passed. Charles looked at Amber, then at the old man, then at the doctor. "You saved my life," he said, tears streaming down. "All of you, I don't know how to thank you." The doctor shook his head. "No need to thank me. Just use the time you still have wisely. Take care of this young woman. That will be all the reward I need." Charles turned his attention to Amber, squeezing her hand. "Amber, I promise you, with every day I have left, I will give you the life you should have had from the beginning. You will never sleep on the streets again. You will never go hungry again. You will never be alone again." Amber collapsed against him, sobbing. Charles wrapped his arms around her. "And now, Grandpa?" she asked when she managed to control her sobs. "What do we do now?" Charles looked out the window, seeing the first rays of sunlight illuminating the sky. He smiled genuinely for the first time in decades. "Now we live, together, like a real family." The months that followed brought profound transformation for both. Charles, with the proper medical care that the doctor provided and personally monitored, managed to stabilize his heart condition better than any professional expected. The 3 to 6 months he had been given extended considerably, defying all prognoses. Amber left the streets, moved into Charles's mansion, resumed the studies she had abandoned years ago, and began to dream again about the future. She transformed before Charles's eyes, blossoming like a flower that finally received water and sunlight after years of drought. Charles learned the true meaning of living not in meeting rooms closing million-dollar deals, but in simple and precious moments with his granddaughter. Long conversations at the dinner table, shared laughter watching movies together, hugs given freely without reservations or formalities. He donated a large portion of his fortune to create shelters and assistance programs for homeless people, established a fund in Victoria's name to help single mothers, and financed the small clinic of the doctor who had saved him so he could continue serving those forgotten by society. The old homeless man also received help, although he accepted only enough to have regular meals, preferring to maintain his simple life of faith. Charles visited him frequently, bringing Amber, and the three became an unlikely but true family, united not by blood or circumstances, but by genuine love and unexpected grace. And every day, without exception, Charles looked at Amber and silently thanked for having received this impossible second chance, this miracle that medicine couldn't fully explain, but that his heart understood perfectly. Love, he finally discovered, really could save lives in ways that went far beyond the physical. He had found redemption in the brown eyes of a young woman who carried the face of his lost daughter, and that was more valuable than all the empire he had built throughout a lifetime. Charles Whitmore, the billionaire businessman who had almost died alone and empty, had finally learned to truly live in his final days, surrounded by the love that had always been available, but that he had been too proud to accept. And when his time finally came, he would depart in peace, knowing that he left behind not just material wealth, but something infinitely more precious, a beloved granddaughter who would carry forward the legacy of redemption and love that he and Victoria had finally, through Amber, managed to build together. Now tell me in the comments where you're from, and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.